You may stand, sit, or kneel to prayer as you wish. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, in whom we live and move and have our being, we, your needy creatures, render you our humble praises for your preservation of us from the beginning of our lives to this day, and for seeing us safely here this evening. For these your mercies, we bless and magnify your glorious name. Let us pray for the world. Loving Father, look with mercy on our world today as we struggle with the deadly disease, COVID-19. Grant diligence to the minds of scientists and researchers, integrity and compassion to manufacturers and suppliers of drugs, carefulness and tenderness to the hands of doctors, nurses, and other caregivers, energy and willingness to tired hospital staff and other workers, patience to the relatives of those who suffer, appreciation on the part of those who need help, and consideration by all for all. Let us pray for our nation, for our Governor General Sandra, Prime Minister Mia, Leader of Opposition Joseph, and all the other ministers of government, for our financial leaders and economists, as we rally through these challenging economic times. Let us give God thanks for our presenters and our moderator, for the ministry of the St. Michael Center Faith and Action and its trustees, for all organizers and participants of this evening's discussion, and for the opportunity of being here. Let us pray that God's Holy Spirit will guide this evening's discussion, that all that is said and done be done to his glory. And now we sum up all our prayers in the words our Savior himself has taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord be with you. Thank you. Please be seated.
Pleasant good night to all of you. My task this evening is a very simple one. It is to welcome you all and also to make a few preliminary remarks. I promise you they will not be very long. I think we have an excellent evening ahead of us, and I'd want us to get on with the business of the evening as soon as possible. So I start by saying a special welcome to all of you here and those watching online to the 4th Annual St. Michael Center Faith and Action Forum. This as I said, it's the fourth year that we're holding this. It takes place as part of the St. Michael Cathedral Church, the Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels annual Patronal Festival. And the topic this evening is a very, very special one. It is very topical, timely, and important. COVID-19 and the Church. I especially welcome this evening Dr. Jeffrey Gibson, the Dean of the Cathedral Church, who will be our moderator. Our two presenters this evening, Dr. Wendy Seeley and Dr. Don Marshall. I'll not go into their details because someone is coming immediately after me to give you fuller details on them. But I also want to especially welcome those who are present in our audience, and especially Dr. Kenneth George, our Chief Medical Officer in the Ministry of Health and Wellness in Barbados, the trustees of the St. Michael Center for Faith and Action, and everyone that is present. You know, some people would say, what is the SMCFA all about? Yes, briefly, the St. Michael Center for Faith and Action is a registered charity, number 1322, formed under the Charities Act, number 243 of Barbados on the 2nd of May, 2017. To those who are present and have a leaflet, you will see what our mission and our objectives are. But for those of you at home, maybe I should just mention them very briefly. The mission is to engage the nation on issues of public interest with an emphasis on the integration of faith and action. And the objectives and goals, we have three, but I'll break them down for you. The advancement of public education and religion, specifically to engage with the questions of faith and action and how they relate to the influencing of personal conduct and the formulation of public policy. To be a community of moral deliberation, bringing the distinctive wisdom of the Christian faith to bear on our understanding of the pursuit of the common good. The second objective, the promotion of purposes beneficial to the community, specifically to create an environment which is conducive for dialogue, promote understanding, and work in partnership with all agencies and all people of goodwill. To cultivate and facilitate an atmosphere for research and publication in the area of public theology, for personal development and the advancement of the church. And thirdly, the relief of poverty, and specifically to respond to human and social needs, demonstrating kindness, showing the love of God to the vulnerable, and to support the faithful in embodying this love in everyday lives. This final part of the third objective is to support such charity or charities on such charitable purpose or purposes as the trustees shall, in their absolute discretion, think fit. I should also add that I welcome the trustees who are here this evening in their numbers. There are 9 of us, and most of us are here. And I want to say that I'm looking forward very much to this evening. I hope that those few preliminary remarks and this welcome sets you up for what should be a very wonderful evening. I thank you very much, and now I hand over to my fellow trustee who will give you some more information. Thank you, and look forward to this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Hadford. Hadford has already welcomed everyone here, so let me just say good evening. My name is Sherry Ann Clark. As Hadford mentioned, I'm a member of the Board of Trustees for the St. Michael Center for Faith and Action. It is my absolute pleasure this evening to introduce our esteemed panel of speakers this evening. As Hadford said, we have a topical issue, but we have the privilege of having a seasoned panel who can bring an evidence-based perspective to the discussion of COVID-19 and the church and its impact on our society. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Wendy Seeley. Dr. Seeley is the Chief Nursing Officer in the Ministry of Health and Wellness. She's held that post from 2013. This past academic year, she was on temporary assignment to the University of the West Indies Faculty of Medical Sciences. There, her teaching areas included human resources for health, policy and ethical issues in nursing and health, testing and measurement in nursing education, and nursing research. Dr. Seeley has also served as the Deputy Chairman of the Regional Nursing Body, Training Coordinator with the Caribbean HIV/AIDS Regional Training Project within the Ministry of Health and Wellness in Barbados. She was a tutor at the School of Nursing at Psychiatric Hospital and at the Barbados Community College, as well as being an active member of the Barbados Nurses Association and the board of the Caribbean Nurses Organization and the Caribbean Partnership of Nurses for AIDS Care. She is currently a member of the Human Resources Management Association of Barbados. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Nursing Education, a Master of Education from UWI Cave Hill, and a Doctor of Philosophy, Education, Policy, and Planning from UWI Cave Hill. She, in terms of research, she has a keen interest in the management and planning of human resources in the health sector among nursing professionals, as well as issues related to the coordination and implementation of policy initiatives at all levels. She also has delved into interesting research in the area of nursing education and migration. In 2011, she published a summary report of the findings of this study entitled A Synopsis of Nurse Migration in the Caribbean, The Case of Barbados, Implications for Health Care, the Nursing Profession, and Nursing Education. She has also been involved with the Needs Assessment Survey among nurses of Caribbean countries for the development and implementation of the Master of Science in Nursing program at UWI Cave Hill. So as you can see, she is more than qualified to speak to us this evening. Our next speaker, Dr. Don Marshall, needs no introduction. He is a well-known and established and respected academic. He is the Director and Senior Fellow of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies based at University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. He holds a Bachelor of Arts and an MPhil from the University of the West Indies, and he gained a PhD in International Political Economy from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK in 1996. His current research projects focus on the globalization phenomenon, offshore financial centers, scientific finance as discourse, industrial policy issues, democracy and governance in the Eastern and Western Caribbean. He has written extensively, but some of his interesting publications include Crisis Narratives, Debt and Development Adjustment, Contemplating Caribbean Small Island States, more crisis to come, Living in the Present, Caribbean Youth Not in Education, Not in Employment, and Not in Training, Rihanna as a Global Icon and Caribbean Threshold Figure, and whose and what world order? Fanon and the salience of the Caribbean reparations endeavor. Dr. Marshall's hobbies include cricket, calypso and its development, and spirituality. So we're glad to offer him the opportunity to marry that interest in spirituality with his research in his presentation later this evening. And finally, moderating the panel is our own Dean Gibson, the very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Gibson, who assumed the office of Dean of the Cathedral of St. Michael and All Angels in February 2016. He previously served as incumbent of the Church of the Holy Trinity in St. Philip from 1986 to 1994, and then went to St. Leonard's, where I came to know him, where he served from 1994 to 2016 for nearly 21 years as rector. He has served as part-time lecturer in Christian ethics at Codrington College since September 1983. He has an interest in the practice of ministry, social ministry, and public theology, hence the center. He's married to Rose, who's with us this evening, and they're the parents of 2 adult daughters, Leah and Joelle. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Dean Jeffrey to get to the main course for this evening's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry-Ann, for the welcome and the introduction. In considering a topic for our annual forum, I think the Board of Trustees had little difficulty in identifying what the focus should be. Since the beginning of this year, the whole world has been literally turned upside down, trying to come to grips with the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. And since mid-March of this year, the churches in Barbados, the Anglican Church, of which we are part, have had to undergo changes as a result of the impact of COVID-19. We were for a period not assembling at all, and we resumed worship in mid-June, and since then we continue to work and minister to people as they adjust to the new setting in the context of worship. So our topic this evening, therefore, is timely and most appropriate. And we thought it further that we not only look at the topic from the point of view of how it's affected liturgy and worship, but more so that we want to hear from somebody who has had the experience and research on the impact in terms of the social and economic impact of COVID-19, because all institutions have been affected by it. The church has been affected by it in terms of worship, but also in terms of its finances. But the church is also challenged by the very nature of the virus to respond to the circumstances. And so we're going to have these 2 presentations, and I'm going to invite Dr. Wendy Seeley to share with us her findings on a survey which she's been conducting in the cathedral, and with the intention of having it a national survey done across the Diocese of Barbados, looking at clergy congregational responses in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Wendy, I think, is very adequately prepared and equipped to guide us in this presentation. Dr. Wendy.
Good night, everyone. Dr. Don Marshall, Director of Salises, our featured speaker for tonight's forum. The Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Gibson, Dean, Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels, Chairman of the St. Michael Center for Faith and Action, and moderator for this forum. Trustees and members of the St. Michael Center for Faith and Action, clergy and congregation of the Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels, specially invited guests, media, ladies and gentlemen, and our families online. A pleasant good night to all gathered and those joining us in the virtual world. It is indeed a distinct honor, privilege, and pleasure for me to be invited to share in this festival forum, especially at this time. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a number of challenges, but also opportunities for us to revisit, rethink, and retool the way we operate, for it is not business as usual. Tonight I will present to you the results of a pilot study conducted during the month of September 2020 to examine the clergy and congregational responses within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I titled it A Pilot Study. During the pandemic, I was at home, sitting down, working from home, because as UE was closed in its physical state, we were still expected to work remotely, and we call it emergency remote learning. And everything was happening around us. And I remember calling the dean and said, Dean, we need to be able to have the evidence to support why we're doing what we're doing. And it is as a result, way back in March, when the idea came into my mind that we needed to provide some evidence and certainly the science to guide what we are going to be doing within the context of the church. As you know, I'm a member of this Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels. And I think it was important to bring these skills and knowledge and marry them with your faith in order to be able to inform what we do at all levels. So this presentation tonight will consider the background, the rationale, the aims and objectives, the survey instrument, the piloting process, results, and next steps. On the 11th of March, the COVID-19 pandemic was declared by WHO based on the alarming levels of spread and severity of the disease. A number of strategies were rolled out by various countries around the world, where the reduction of numbers for gatherings, the recommendations with respect to physical distancing between persons if in gatherings, also called social distancing, no touch greetings, and other such practices. This had implications for the way of life, culture, religious structures, including the knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and practices of religious leaders and their congregations around the world. My examination of the spiritual and religious structures across the globe and the specific responses of spiritual leaders to such a pandemic as COVID-19 revealed a dearth of literature, of research literature. My observation of a number of websites and documents and other paraphernalia from various religious denominations and organizations usually followed the guidelines proposed by governments, health authorities at the international, regional, and country levels. Within our own Caribbean region, as the pandemic progressed, countries started to record cases of COVID-19 on a daily basis. Barbados recorded its first case of COVID-19 on March 17th, at which point the country's national response to public health threat was activated. And we all know what that looked like. They had the stage 0, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. And while we are at stage 0, we were preparing all that we can to sensitize persons as to what they needed to do. Once we are at stage 1, we had suspected or confirmed cases. At stage 2, confirmed human-to-human transmission in country. And extensive stage 3, extensive human-to-human transmission. And we know those very well. It's noted that these measures had implications for the public and private gatherings, and such other events as including churches, gatherings in churches and places of public worship. I must say that the Anglican Church in Barbados responded quite early to the pandemic by issuing a notice to its members of the proposed changes to practices in the various churches and proceedings. I was fortunate to have been called by Dean Jeffrey to a meeting of one of the very first meetings of the management team of the diocese to look at what we would be doing as a diocese. And the notice, a very first notice came out on March 7th, headed, "Greetings to the faithful in the face of the coronavirus COVID-19. This aforementioned document outlined a number of measures which was recommended for implementation for Sunday, the 8th of March. It noted that these measures had implications for the public and private gatherings and other places of worship. This position was taken within the context of guidance from the Ministry of Health and Wellness Barbados, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, His Grace the Most Reverend Dr. Howard Gregory, Archbishop of the West Indies, who had provided each diocesan bishop in the province with guidance which he was using in his own diocese. Persons were encouraged to wash their hands frequently, preferably with soap and water, or use hand sanitizer and 70% alcohol base, as well as tissues when sneezing and coughing. And there were a number of measures, and you know them better than I do, or just as well. Physical interaction during services, including the sign of the peace, will be suspended. Holy Communion will be administered in one kind. The parishioners who fell ill and displayed influential symptoms to stay at home. These were a number of measures that were implemented. Why this study? It was important to have this study to identify what was the knowledge of the clergy and congregation members about signs and symptoms of COVID-19 and the public health measures being advocated to reduce the transmission of the virus. It's also important to determine the factors influencing this knowledge. We want to also examine their attitudes towards the public health measures being implemented to determine their compliance with the guidelines presented by the national authorities. And last but not least, to examine the beliefs and practices of respondents about the pandemic and the measures imposed and the impact on their own spiritual beliefs. A customized questionnaire was developed consisting of 18 closed and open-ended questions. It focused on demographic information which look at sex, age range, and your position in church, sources of information about COVID-19, knowledge of symptoms about COVID-19, public health measures to manage the pandemic, attitudes towards the measures instituted, changes in liturgical practices in the church, beliefs about the nature of COVID-19, and the implications for the individual's spiritual beliefs, as well as practices related to COVID-19 and changes in worship. Now, why do a pilot? Often there are unforeseen problems when in a larger project that may occur with a larger project, and therefore it's important to complete a pilot, which is a small version or trial run of the major study. In this instance, permission has been sought for a wider study with the Diocese of Barbados. But in the meanwhile, the pilot permission was granted to conduct the pilot right here at the Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels. Now, data was collected during the month of September, and this was done electronically via Google Forms and hard copies of the questionnaire, which were distributed among clergy and congregation members who indicated a preference for this method. There were 55 respondents in all, 36 females and 19 males, 65 and 35% respectively. There is no disaggregation of the data as it related to the clergy and the congregation, since there are only 2 clergy responses. Age range. A majority of persons who responded were over 70 years, 35%. This was followed by the 61 to 70-year age group, 30%, and 17% of persons were in the 51 to 60-year age range. An overall total of 84% of persons who responded to this survey were actually over 50 years old. And these numbers are fairly representative of the overall demographic of the church and certainly the wider diocese. Time spent absorbed in news about COVID-19. A majority of persons, 62%, indicated that they spent 30 minutes or less, with 25% indicating that they spend at least 1 to 2 hours on daily on the daily basis watching, reading, or listening to news reports about COVID-19. This may give an indication of the interests, sources of data, and other general evidence which may inform the knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and practices of respondents, where the more time spent in these situations may be indicative of greater knowledge or confusion about the pandemic, depending on the source of information. The most preferred source of knowledge among the respondents was television, which was followed by print and electronic media. The second preferred source of knowledge was radio. However, the least preferred source of knowledge was word of mouth and social media. These responses are in keeping with the expected norm, since these latter sources of information are known to be least reliable in the form of word of mouth or hearsay, which can be twisted and embellished and even produced as fake news to create sensation to intrigue the unsuspected and gullible recipient. Persons are therefore preferable of trusted and reliable sources of information which are held accountable by law for sharing accurate and trustworthy information. Knowledge about basic major signs and symptoms of COVID-19. Most persons express excellent, very good, or good knowledge of the major signs and symptoms: dry cough, fever, difficulty in breathing, fatigue, loss of taste or smell, congestion, or runny nose. This is indicative that, generally speaking, persons have been listening to the messages via public service announcements in their various forms. A majority of approximately 90% of persons answered the questions about the COVID-19 disease correctly, although they had not participated in formal sensitization sessions. This may serve to imply that the public service announcements are reaching the target audiences and getting the message across as intended. However, ongoing sensitization and update sessions with prevention messages are important and are to be supported. Attitudes to public health measures. There was a strong agreement among the majority of respondents about the public health measures following the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, social distancing, sneeze, cough etiquette, hand hygiene measures, avoiding touching mouth, eyes, and nose, and in what we call avoiding men, mouth, eyes, and nose, use of face masks, suspension of public gatherings. There was some agreement to closure of churches and places of public worship, reduction in numbers at funerals and weddings, reduction in business hours, closure of businesses, and the imposed curfew. It was noted that a few persons were undecided on these latter matters. A majority of persons strongly agreed with the following, and these were liturgical practices that were changed: suspension of the greeting of peace, use of the bread alone, communion in one kind, using hand hygiene practices during the Eucharist, receiving communion standing. A few persons were undecided or disagreed with the changes in these practices. This may be indicative of the knowledge of the meaning of such practices and their beliefs, which must be balanced with the science and evidence which is being presented about the nature of the pandemic, which is constantly evolving. Respondents' belief about the nature of COVID-19. A majority, 76% of the respondents, indicated that they know COVID-19 to be a viral infection. Of note, 9% indicated that they thought it was a form of a biological weapon, and 15% divided and indicated it may be a seasonal flu, a sign of biblical prophecy, or a combination of the foregoing. So there are a number of people who felt that it was a combination of all of these things, not one particular thing. What was very instructive for me and almost very pleasing was the open-ended responses. And to this question, has the change in worship practices due to the COVID-19 affected your spiritual beliefs? All persons responded positively to say that their spiritual beliefs were still intact, except one person who indicated that their spiritual needs are not being met. Some of the responses, there are a number of them here, but I wanted to share them with you. The first one says, I'm an optimist, believing that the outcome for overall survival is likely to be positive, although a vaccine might take a few years. My faith is strong. Nothing can stop me from believing in God. Nothing or no one will change my belief or commitment to God. I believe in my Lord and King, and therefore I put my trust in Him unconditionally. They are necessary for managing disease. The God of the people who have to follow the regulations is the God of the people who have to institute and enforce them. I watch services online and listen to services on the radio. God is still in the midst of us, be it COVID or otherwise. I have faith in the Almighty. With a strong Christian faith and the protocols which my church is adhering to, the change of worship does not affect my spiritual beliefs. One has a chance to view the services online. It's a test of faith. There's still the option to worship virtually, so persons are warming to the fact that they can still worship virtually. The gestures and rituals are outward expressions of the spiritual life. They do not define me. My faith remains strong. Finally, the church as the body of Christ is not established on the basis of the state of our physical well-being. Important as life here is, it is the life hereafter towards which we are striving. This too will pass. The preferred method for receiving church services, a majority of persons prefer the in-person worship, or let's say face-to-face worship, followed by electronic media for streaming via Facebook or YouTube. This was followed by television and radio. The use of social and electronic media platforms has really exploded with innovative strategies being presented for worship via these media. However, the face-to-face worship is still the preferred method by many persons. These are the preliminary results that I found, and I find that they were very instructive. The next steps for this research really is to revise the research plan based on the results of this pilot. I am also in the process of awaiting approval from the diocese to conduct the bigger study, which will be across all the parishes, hopefully, of this diocese. And the final step is to go back to the Institutional Review Board approval for implementation through the Ethics Committee, so that we recognize it is important to have this research supported by the ethical process. And I really would want to take this opportunity to thank the Dean and the Church Council, the congregation here at St. Michael, the Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels, for granting me the permission to conduct this pilot. As a member of this church, the Church Council, the Synod, I felt really impelled to do this and to really bring the evidence to us to help us and inform what we are going to do. I want to thank those persons who completed the questionnaire, and I trust that the results of this pilot, and certainly the bigger study once approval is granted, will seek to inform current and future decision-making, prioritization of policies and programs within the Anglican Diocese of Barbados. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome your questions and comments when the time comes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wendy Seeley, for sharing the findings of the research conducted in this cathedral church, drawn across clergy and the congregational membership on the responses in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm certain we have been enlightened by your observations, and we look forward to the discussions which will follow. Now, in cricketing terms, Dr. Wendy would have bowled the first ball, and I'm certain we have been at the point where we are probably seeing the ball fairly clearly. We've seen the context of which we're going to respond in terms of worship. I think equally important is always to have somebody else on the other hand who could provide the opening bowler with the appropriate challenge. And I think in the person of of Dr. Marshall, who himself is a noted bowler, will be of similar substance and keep the pace going, so to speak. Now, Dr. Marshall's task is to help us to appreciate the socio-economic impact of COVID. And given his own professional background, I'm certain he will deliver us some good material to reflect on. Because the church, we've heard about the church as a worshiping community, but the church that's only one aspect, no matter how important it is, it's only one aspect of the church's witness. The church is located in the context of the lives of people, and Christ, we affirm, is the center of our lives. And therefore, it's important for us to hear what has been happening really in the lives of people, what has been happening in the context of social and the economic experiences. We've heard about the fallout in terms of businesses. We have noticed the matter about unemployment. We have noticed how people have responded. But what can we gather from the professionals about the impact of COVID on the social and economic landscape of our lives? Dr. Marshall, it's your turn.
Thank you, Ed.
You're free.
Yes. Thank you very much. I want to do the correct thing, which is to get the protocol right. And I'm going to try my best at it. The Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Gibson, fellow panelist, Dr. Wendy Seeley. I also want to acknowledge the board, members of the Board of Trustees of the the St. Michael's Center for Faith and Action. I also want to thank and acknowledge the presence of Reverend Sandra Hazel, who gave the opening prayers. And I also want to acknowledge the audience physically present and those that are online. And I want to say a special thank you to all of you for having me and for asking me to participate. I hope that I do justice to the invitation. Okay, so I have my speaking notes via the technology. And so this is why I'm holding my mobile phone in my hand. Let me say first that, like with all presentations to do with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we should begin to acknowledge that the world has, for a majority of its inhabitants, have had to deal with a number of interacting and converging crises prior to the pandemic. So we've got a climate change crisis. We've also had a great recession, this is a great world recession, marked by a not so great world economic recovery. Children today face nastier job markets than their grandparents and their parents. The uncertainty in the job markets prior to the pandemic worldwide has been quite uncertain. Commodity prices, key things like wheat and so on, have been fluctuating wildly. We are also aware that there's also a crisis of leadership among great powers in international relations. So, in essence, in terms of world order, there's been quite a high degree of uncertainty, and in terms of the international financial system, it's been marked more by volatility than stability. And so with those interacting and converging crises came a pandemic that upended not only ways in which we understand the natural order of our economies, the natural order of our societies and so on, but there's a way in which the pandemic came at the end or followed a period where we have all known austerity and we've had to come to grips with existing and rising inequalities. So I think it's important to set the backdrop for understanding the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. And in our space, in Barbados, that impact rested atop 10 to 12 years of adjustment fatigue. That's the best way to put it. Where we've had to grapple with wage stagnation, rising inflation, which translates into rising costs of living. So, anomie and restlessness among large swathes of our youth populations, and a crisis in our values complex. So I'm painting a picture here so that you well understand that we don't come into the COVID-19 pandemic imagining that what existed before was akin to the Garden of Eden. That we really came into the pandemic with some extant deep structural problems, both internal and external. Although I don't like to use the word external when we're speaking about the world, because we are in and of the world, and we, as countries, as societies and so on, we are at the same time international as we are national, global as we are local. And these are artificialities. There's no, as it were, exogenous shock that affects us inside. We are all interacting spaces. And as we engage and navigate world affairs, as we engage and navigate world markets, as we engage and navigate inter-imperial powers or core powers, we have to continue to find a space for our own development, for our own self-determination, and reproducibility as a society and economy. On to the pandemic. Now, the pandemic in and of itself is a threat to lives, particularly for persons who are especially vulnerable. I'm talking about those with health challenges, diabetes, etc. Persons over 80, I mean, this is what the science is revealing, persons over 80, and the challenge has been everywhere for the better adaptation of health systems to meet the needs of older people and people with health challenges. And that's been there for a while, but with COVID, it's more acute, because the painful truth is that infection increases the specter of more deaths, of we losing these persons, where without the pandemic, they can manage their compromised health and so on for longer than normal, for longer than one would expect without this particular virus. So there's a health challenge, and what it did is it exposed those countries that provided universal healthcare systems relatively efficiently. Those countries have managed to contain the first wave of contagion, the spread. So this is why the Caribbean region, parts of Asia, parts of Africa have come out to be some of the better performers in relation to containing the first wave. But we speak of the first wave because history teaches us in the Spanish flu and pandemic that there was a second wave, and in some cases those that managed the first wave well found themselves in trouble with the second wave. And the second wave is more infection spread and the rest of it. Now, psychologists can better argue than I could what happens to the human condition once you go through a period of triumph. You know, adversity, then triumph. And I suppose complacency sets in and the rest of it. But hopefully, through God and the work of, and through him and the work of the specialists, we get the message and we continue to wear the mask, we continue to do things that will ward off a second contagion. However, there is a sort of massive impact that has followed the pandemic, and it has, the language would be, oh, the supply chains and networks around the world are frozen, oh, we are not getting the international trade has slowed, and so on and so forth. But if we had to put that in a nutshell, we would acknowledge that we, in Barbados, indeed the region, we rely on open trade in order to meet the needs of our people in the areas of food, fuel, and medicine. Let's just stick to those three areas. And if you have closed markets, and closed access to those markets, then you could see what is happening in relation to the direct impact. Tourism, with the collapse, I can't call it any other thing but a collapse. It's historic that the airline industry has been in free fall the way it has been. Pilots are going home, have been sent home. Some airlines have been grounded, some with names that we are very familiar with. And that has meant that, consequentially, our source markets for attracting tourists have dried up. We don't have the airlines nor the people themselves sufficiently moved at this time, both in terms of economic constraints and also health constraints, to travel. So we are dealing with a crisis really that is a historically unique in that it's safe to use the term ground zero. Barbados is back at ground zero, or it is facing ground zero in relation to its existing model of development. And I think we need to be clear about that. Sometimes you could be living in the death rattle of a change, but still feel like things are still normal. Well, as our government continue to manage repercussions, things can appear normal. But we are not assured of a monthly salary even as we go out to work in the public service, at the university, at the hospital. We are not assured of a monthly salary 4 or 5 months down the road. Such is the nature of what is happening in relation to both the government's capacity to collect the same amounts of revenue it needs and the government's capacity to earn foreign exchange. So we are facing a severe crisis, and it's historic, and the social unease will continue for quite some time until a vaccine is found and can be easily purchased and adapted, and hopefully we would not have to go through a very painful period where supposedly disposable peoples are asked to be the guinea pigs of these various vaccine trials until we get to a pristine one. You see, we are not even at the beginning of the cusp of the nature of the crisis. The search for the vaccine will produce its own, or reproduce, schisms again that certainly highlights inequalities, who are the peoples and populations perceived to be other with a capital O, who should be seen and treated as disposable, and so on and so forth. We are at the cusp of seeing that as firms and countries jostle to come up with the ideal elixir, the ideal vaccine to make available to contain the spread. I also would like to say to you that with Barbados approaching 40% unemployment, there's a way in which the lecture can begin right with that statistic. If you can think through what are the socioeconomic ripples that will affect any country facing 40%, this is off the charts. This is not something that economists normally deal with. If we're talking about economies in free fall, they understand the economics discipline is also in free fall. Because the toolkit of solutions, never mind their bluster, never mind pretense at doctoral authority, the toolkit that you utilize to treat to recessions, economic downturns, and so on, cannot be applied to this ground zero situation. This is why, as early as April, end of March, April, the new head of the IMF practically said to developing countries and developed countries alike, you do what is absolutely necessary to get your economies going again. So if you have to print money, if the state has to be the source of new employment, if jobs have to be created for its own sake, you do whatever is necessary to begin to get out of the deep malaise that we're in. Now, I'm happy that, or would have recently heard that the BERT program is suspended because it goes in the direction of the administration beginning to think a bit out the box about what is going to be required to mitigate the impact. And I want to come directly to the church because I'm going to treat the church, I'm not going to slip into a discussion about the secular and the sacred. I wanted to speak about different social organizations. And I want to tell you that hierarchies everywhere are going to face increasing challenge. All social institutions and hierarchies will face greater challenge. Greater challenge in terms of their authority being questioned, their governance practices being questioned, as people look for pragmatic and thoughtful solutions to treat to their predicaments. So we saw an early adjustment by the church by providing online services and virtual embeddedness in order to reach congregations that had to be physically distanced and so on and so forth. I think fortuitously this dragged the church, and I'm using the word church in a broad sense, this dragged the church into late modern understandings of how best to reach different populations that are mobile. Some of them are stuck. Some of them are not drawn to what used to be the attractive ways that you would bring people to engage in fellowship. So, interestingly, the church had to adapt in order to meet the question of reaching out, building community, building a faith, and restoring hope and connectivity with its followers and others that believe in the faith. So while it exposes a way of building community and modernizes and updates it, I want you to know at the same time that this virtual embeddedness begins to blur the lines between the secular and the sacred. I say that because not only are you going to be treated, and you were treated, to the pastor in his home, where the place, the church, his personal space, the home, become melded, as it were. But the lives of each other begins to be more known, so that the artificiality that occurs between the home and the church begins to break down. He has to live by the example of the principles that he and the faith promotes. So there's a way in which greater accountability is going to be expected of the church. Greater accountability. And I say this because even if we step aside from looking and contemplating what it means to be virtually embedded, while keeping up this notion of artificial distinction between the secular and the sacred, even if we rest that aside philosophically and we deal with the question of the legitimacy of the church, and this is generically, has not been able to win membership among youth populations, largely to do with the narrative not being compelling enough, the messaging not being relevant enough, and the role of the church being seen as not quite modern enough. So, what is it that Dr. Marshall is saying to you? The relevant causes of today are to do with justice pursuits, justice fights. So, gender justice, human rights, climate change, injustices, constitutes the language of oppression for which the quest for deliverance is a recent and modern phenomenon, late modern demand. The church has to adapt if it wants to be addressing social, if it wants to address fellowship, it has to look at the question of the human. What is the human, who is the human of 2020? What is the role and condition, what are the role and responsibilities of the church addressing the human and the quest for deliverance in 2020? The indivisibility of the body, mind, soul means that the question of contemplating what it means to be human becomes a central preoccupation at this time, and for which religious texts are rich in historical examples of how that question was treated in the past. But the question was always treated in the past within the prevailing conceptions of what it meant to be human. To be human in the 21st century means the question of human rights. Who's allowed to be considered human? Who's perceived as subhuman? What languages, metaphors, and so on invariably exclude, and how do we enact a language and a vocabulary that includes? So these are the kinds of things that need to be done if we are going to have an overhaul of consciousness driving faith-based organizations today, relevant to the immiseration and the hopelessness that will continue to mount with the COVID pandemic. There are as many people that will flee from their situation, their material lack, and run to the church. But they're running to the church to become in touch with their own spirituality, and the church must meet the challenge by being able to sit in commune and contemplate, discuss, reflect on what it is to be human. So the quest for deliverance, captured in new and dynamic ways, continues to change. It is not by accident that Black Lives Matter is not just a civil societal expression in the United States. It happens to have diasporic connections with every society, where when you scratch the surface a little bit, you see a slave era just beneath. These are issues we've papered over, pretend doesn't exist. But part of the challenge of rebuilding our economies, rebuilding our societies, also involve overcoming coloniality. That sense where we engage in collective self-doubt about the future, and about new ideas, that sense in which we engage in collective self-hate, where we hear someone with new ideas but just simply believe it can't work, the sense in which a haughty coalition of anti-industrial development folk continue to influence the policy direction of where they think this country should go. There are some people that believe we need more by way of tourism promotion, less by way of industrial development, inventions, and so on. Don't want to get into that discussion. But it all comes back to a crumbing sense of a lack of identity and so on. We don't love ourselves enough, and the answers to the question about what it means to be human has to address the question of this deep, abiding coloniality of which the church was deeply implicated in disseminating such discourses. Discourses that otherize black flesh, black bodies. Okay? We have to confront these things. How do we overcome the idiot center of ourselves that Austin Clarke so eloquently captured in the book Growing Up Stupid Under the Union Jack? In there had a message for every civil societal organization. You're not going to realize the multiple freedoms and emancipation possible in freeing up the soul until you confront the question of the idiot center of yourself. And that idiot center of yourself has been created through years of colonial conditioning based on this notion that others of a particular hue, from a particular country or geophysical space, are innately superior over yourselves. So, overcoming coloniality is part of the mission, part and parcel of what it means to be, human. And I also want to make another point before I close. Two key things I want to make note of. Right now, we pretend that we now is the intellectual community. Let me just say the university, the West Indies. There's this taken for grantedness when it comes to the church and faith-based organizations. We think we know religion. We think we know about the church. We think we know about the sacred because deeply ensconced on our minds is that we have gone out to church. We know the experience. It's part of it's part culturally who we are as a people and so on and so forth. But this, like any social organization, requires interrogation, investigation, serious research. And I was happy when I heard Wendy come to speak to an aspect of research being done. But we must make the church the subject too of inquiry. We must ask after its closed governance systems and models. We must ask after its failure to embrace unless through the prism of tolerance. Because tolerance is propagated as the route through which you embrace the other. However you define the other with capital O, otherization of people constitutes a form of discrimination. And as you otherize with a capital O, you wind up committing sins of the kind that oppressors have had in different contexts and circumstances. So, it's important for the church to be subject to critique, subject to investigation, subject to the same winds of democratic change that is blowing through every institution. And it follows every time we are at a pivotal moment in history. History demonstrates that human beings will question and challenge authority top to bottom. And we're in that moment where there will be a critical questioning. Like the students are questioning CHC. They're no longer accepting the bourgeois norm of being polite. Once officialdom says, we will review, they're taking to the streets and they're saying, it's our lives that are being affected. It's the rules that are tone deaf, and we demand answers now. People are becoming impatient with hierarchical organizations, and we have to respond. The revolution is not occurring on your television sets where you will witness Trump either losing the election or winning the election and the fallout that follows. That's not where the revolution will come. The revolution is occurring all around us. And people are questioning institutions, questioning these organizations, and faith-based organizations are no exception, and should subject itself to critique and be open and willing to field interviews, participate in surveys, etc., etc. And researchers have got to stop assuming, or rather I should say the intellectual community has to stop assuming that we understand the church, but we need to inquire into some of the things they're doing. So when I read about the St. Michael Center for Faith and Action, has been in existence for the last 3 years, I'm reading the church responding imaginatively and intelligently to developments going on. But how much of that is codified, captured, and made sense of in the growing body of knowledge about the evolving church in Barbados? Okay. So the socioeconomic impact then of the COVID-19 will not only witness, will continue to witness debates on the way forward as we try to navigate our way out of the multiple crises we face, but a great questioning of all social organizations as exists, their legitimacy is at stake, and people will continue to ask disturbing questions. They will continue to interrupt, and they will continue to disrupt. What we want to be able to do is to respond with empathy, intelligence, and with responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall, for your as you ended there, the thought came to me. It's not an original thought, but in summing up the impact of COVID-19 on the church, I'm asking myself whether the COVID itself could not provide a type of divine disturbance for the church. A time for us to discover who God is calling us to be in this generation, recognizing that we are called to be human in the fullest sense, and as we affirm the Christian faith, we affirm that Jesus came that we might have life and have it abundantly. At this juncture, we still think that that is the goal to which we're certain, but at the moment, this human experience is really going through a disturbance, perhaps an evolution. And who we are, the systems on which we are governed, including the church, we do need to open ourselves to whatever is being fashioned as a result of this experience. Thank you very much. It's our chance now to enter into dialogue with the two panelists. We're also going to be fielding questions from those who are online on our Facebook page. Just send your questions and they will be communicated to me, and I'll share them or ask the secretary to share them in general. I am particularly impressed with the framework that we have set. An understanding of who the church is and what the church has experienced over the past 6 to 8 months, and the setting of which we have been placed, human beings in the context of small Barbados, but we are part of the experience of a world, a global experience. And one wonders in that setting where the notion of globalization, how does it factor in this overall experience? We know we think of globalization in terms of political and economic terms, but here we are experiencing it from a point of view of health and policy terms. And maybe that's the point we can start our discussion. But I'm open. We're open to your comments, observations, and I'm certain the panelists will be able to respond to your observations or questions. There's a microphone. Please use the microphone for the benefit of everyone. And you may take the mask, you can use this one. Take the mask off as you speak. And
good night. My name is Gavin Drake. I attend the St. Michael Cathedral in Orlando. And, well, you know that there was a virus that came about by the name of coronavirus, and give it the name COVID-19. And through that there, the country and many countries throughout the world.
Turn it on.
Right.
Okay. And many countries throughout the world had to be borders had to be closed off, and people had to be home, places had to be closed off and things like that there. And it was very scary when I first heard about the coronavirus and what being caused by such a thing. And we all know that government, which in our government too, had to take certain precautions in seeing that our lives and lives of others been safe, and that was something great. And what I must say that it's a very serious thing with this coronavirus, and we cannot take it lightly because there's nothing to take lightly. We know that we know certain precautions we had to go about taking distances apart from each other and all kind of different procedures. And when this thing first came about, we had 6 o'clock was the time we had to go in, and many people couldn't really content with things like that there. And well, we had to go along with what was happening because that was the rules of the government that made those rules, and it was for the safeness of our lives and lives of ours, like I said. And what I would like to say is that the coronavirus is nothing to take lightly. And what I would hope, and I'm looking for as time goes by, where a vaccine must come about, and I know that it's not going to be an easy thing putting a vaccine together, because it's something that takes time and certain things have to be done to put a vaccine together. But I hope that with the intelligent and brilliant people that have in our country, Barbados, and throughout the world, I would hope that here in Barbados, that with the intelligent and brilliant people that have here, that something could happen with a vaccine coming from here, just like coming from the wider world. But it's going to take some time, because nothing that can happen overnight. When this coronavirus started and you hear about the many people that were dying from the illness, it really had me scared, because I say at first when I heard about it, it's really I call it a monster. But I hope that as life goes by, that a vaccine will come about for the coronavirus, because I know that there are many illnesses that we are acquainted with before that we had vaccine that, well, not for curing, but I would say treat the illness. And I would hope that when a vaccine come about, that will serve the purpose for many years, because people have to travel, and people have to travel to our country too. And we don't want to be getting affected when we travel, or we don't want people to get affected when they occur in our country.
Okay, probably perhaps we can get a response from Dr. Wendy, or if anyone wants to hear what the current status is. I mean, it's a good hope that Barbados could be in the forefront of producing a vaccine, but would you have anything to say about where we are medically? And I know Dr. George is here, yeah. But I'm not sure if that's something you could comment on. But just to say that if you have a question, you could probably just narrow it down to a question, or not, we can focus on this aspect of it, the medical side of it. Would that be sufficient? That we can focus on where we are medically, taken from your comments, your own experiences of the virus.
Yes, we could focus on that there too. We could pursue and look to get ahead and see what come about in forming a vaccine.
Yes, but we have some persons here who can probably help us to know where we're at, and maybe Dr. Wendy?
I mean to say that, it's not in the wider world that they have all the intelligent and brilliant people. We here in Barbados do have very intelligent and brilliant people that I know for sure could go ahead and pursue something as a vaccine.
Of course.
Yes, and I acknowledge that. So let's
Yes.
Let's Dr. Wendy respond to. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for your comments. They're well appreciated within the context of a member of the congregation, and your own feelings about how you responded and felt about what was happening around us.
Thank you.
Yes. It's important to recognize that vaccine trials are ongoing. We don't know when a vaccine will come, but at the same time, it's very important to ensure that we continue our preventative measures. Wearing our masks, social distancing, hand hygiene, making sure we wash our hands with soap and water, making sure that wherever possible, making sure that we don't touch our mouth, our eyes, and our face.
Which is correct, yes.
All these are important things. So thank you very much for your comments.
And I thank you too.
Okay.
This is another.
Okay, this question is for Dr. Wendy. Given the limited age range in this study, which is also indicative of the wider diocese, do you think it is important to consider expanding the survey somehow to include more youth?
A question in relation to the age range and youth.
That, as I mentioned, the number of persons who really responded were the persons who were online and who were present. Under 10% of the persons in our congregations are under 30 years old. As I indicated, 84% of the respondents were over 50 years old. So it is certainly within the context of our own congregations. And I think Dr. Marshall mentioned it is us being able to attract the younger people. And it means, and I think even from the preliminary results of what I found, it's important that we need to streamline what we're doing and how we're doing it. It can't be business as usual. I appreciate that we have our traditions and our rituals, but we have to find innovative ways and strategies to be able to deliver the message. And when I look online at other institutions, places of worship, they're finding ways to do these things, whether it's virtual choirs, whether it is the way they deliver their services. I think we have to think out of the box, that was mentioned before, and find those ways that will capture the imagination of persons beyond the traditional. As a nurse, we often say don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there are things that have worked and continue to work. But we also have to look and move forward within the context of the world that we live in and what is being offered from a technological perspective. Earlier this evening, myself and Reverend Marcus were having a discussion about the digital divide. It is important that we have the technology, but also the balance, that we don't leave the people like my mother, who's 80 years old and could barely turn on her phone to make a call, behind, because they're the persons who have kept us and have laid the foundation for us. But we also have to be able to reach into the future and be able to capture and bring those who are now coming. So I believe that there is that opportunity, and I'm hoping that with the wider survey and the permission to move to the wider diocese, that we can capture more of the age range, the youth, as we would call it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me thank the presenters for sharing with us this afternoon, but invite Dr. Marshall to comment on two things. One, of course, is that the economic impact of the nation has hit the church particularly, and churches are struggling financially. Some of them are barely holding on because of the economic models that they've adopted in the past, which are unsustainable in this time. But their very existence is threatened. And that then has implications for the capacity for the church to pick up its usual role in assisting government in meeting some of the needs of society. The church has been in the forefront of the preschool hour feeding programs, the after school hour tutorials, and so on. And with the limited funds, it is going to have an impact on being able to respond to the homeless and to vagrants and etc. The list goes on. And I want to comment on that aspect of the economic impact. And then secondly, you're inviting the churches to do research. And it is an area that we are completely unfamiliar with in the general sense. Any research we do is largely tucked away in our seminaries. It is a new area into which you're going to be inviting us without the skills. And to be able to reflect on ourselves is going to be a unique challenge for the church. Thank you.
Dr. Marshall.
Thank you for that. On the second point first, it might have been my articulation, so I apologize. I wasn't challenging the church to research itself, actually. I was saying that it's time that the intellectual community stop assuming or presuming to know and to undertake research into the church and into the sacred, because it's a subject field that is a part of who we are as a Caribbean people. Its presence has been here. We shouldn't assume that things have remained static. We should be able to identify, when we speak of the church, don't speak of it in a homogeneous sense, that there are some churches that are in fact adapting, modernizing, updating, and attracting greater shares of young people than others. So we need to identify those exemplars. And you know, what is it in their, I don't know if the term is exegesis? Exegesis? I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But, right, what is it in their exegesis, I think? What is it in their practice? What is it in their outreach that gets a greater share of new members who are members of the youth than others? So that work needs to be done. And obviously, the message too is that the church should also understand itself as, like any social organization, subject to critique. So that was it there. On the first point, you know, in many ways, pre the pandemic, governments around the world have been encouraged by IMF and other councils to pass the burden of welfare and protection of the vulnerable onto society, onto individuals. Individuals are supposed to be able to shoulder that responsibility more and more in the interest of ending this mendicancy. This is the argument, this is how it goes, that governments need to spend less on social care, and that the voluntary sector should pick that up. Individuals should look to improve their own circumstance, retrain, retool, etc. And those that are vulnerable either look to the church or look to voluntary organizations to, through self-organization, seek to gain some protection or relief. Now, that whole narrative, that entire narrative, will become upended or become overturned because of the nature of what's happening to the voluntary sector, the church, etc. You have too many, the impact on the church, for example, the financial impact on the church has been severe. And the research I was doing, looking at some scholarly work on the impact on the church with COVID, that's a key area identified. And many churches have turned to solidarity pacts with other faiths. They've turned more towards collaboration with other churches to do the same thing, you know. So like a church may have a discrete program unto itself. Because of the crisis, they're forced to sit with other churches to say, can we do this collectively? And so that's one response. Other responses have been to do novel things that get into crowdfunding, to just diversify its financial model, basically, to come up with ways to meet its customary pastoral care obligations through ways of raising funds. Some have gone to adopt the practice of asking congregations to donate monies from their salary. And I'm talking about those churches that don't rely on tithes. They've gone that route. And it's a clear case of them saying we are cash strapped. And we have an excellent responsibility, moral, ethical, and otherwise, to look after our brothers and sisters. So, but the reason why the research remain, as it were, unresolved on the ideal models going forward, largely to do with the fact that we don't quite know when a vaccine will be in place and when normal, quote unquote, business can resume. That is to say, the ways in which churches raise money and so on. So that challenge remains open. But certainly it exposes this idea that the state should somehow leave that responsibility or pass on that responsibility to the voluntary sector, to civil organizations at the church, and so on. That's being questioned now more and more in light of this crisis.
I just want to add a very brief follow-up, because the way you answered the first part suggests that you're either making the academic community other to the church, or the church other to the academic community. That may be a false dichotomy.
Right, it might be, because they're in fields, the theological field, there can be studies of the church within the field of theology. But I am particularly interested to know, how does a social theorist who is not a member of a church interrogates the church, sees the church, examines, analyzes the church? That for me will be of research of a particular kind of interest.
There's another question coming.
That, by the way, they do it all over the world.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, good night. Sorry. We have some questions from persons online. All right. From Reverend Ambrose, I believe this might be to Dr. Wendy. Did your research address how persons contribute to stewardship whilst away from church? Because as a worshiping community, tithes and offerings and fundraising are a part of the in-person worship. So did your research address that?
Thank you very much for that question. The research, the pilot did not address the issue of offerings and tithes. To tell you the truth, at the time that the original questions were developed, we were just at the beginning of the pandemic, and the thought of monies coming in were not even thought of. I didn't even begin to think that that would have become an issue, because this thing has evolved so quickly. So really, for this pilot, it has informed that that is the area that needs to be addressed and will be addressed in the revision for the research plan, certainly. So thank you very much.
We have another question, again for you, Dr. Wendy. When or can we foresee a return to normalcy in church service, and what modifications, if any, to allow wine? I don't think this might be to you. Then I don't think this might be to you, more to the dean. What modifications, if any, to allow wine to be served in church?
Well, I will answer the question to the extent that we are following the science and the national health authorities. We are guided by the national COVID-19 guidelines, which are law, and this is what we are following right now. All that we are doing within the context when we enter a building and have our temperature checked, wearing our mask and social distancing, even within the context of the church, how we do what we do, it is guided by law. And I can't say when that will change. Our cases, as long as we have cases, these things will be maintained, and we have to continue to follow what is happening from the national authorities, and we'll be guided by such. I won't like to put Dr. George on the spot. He's here in the audience, and but certainly I am speaking the truth. Am I, sir? Thank you.
That question was posed by Adrian Lord. I have another question from Lenroy Cabby. KB? Yes? Okay. Sorry. What about the socioeconomic impact on straight line churches and the immediate future? On straight line churches. I'm hopeful that he will type in also to tell me what straight line churches are.
Or is it main line?
I'm assuming that's probably what he means.
Yeah, Father Lenroy KB is a priest in the St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, trained
right.
in.
So this is verbatim here. So I'm going to assume he might mean.
What's
yes.
the second part of the question, please? Can you repeat?
Sure. What about the socioeconomic impact on straight line churches, or probably streamline churches, and presently and in the immediate future? So what's the socioeconomic impact presently and in the immediate future?
Streamline churches. Let's assume that it means streamline churches.
I'm assuming, yes, I'm assuming.
Yeah? And which then makes it a very...
So yes, streamline, yes, I can see the point. Yes.
Yeah. Because I think, I'm just going to jump in here, but I think the very good Reverend might be better able to answer. But I think we have reached a threshold moment in the delivery of service where we would never go back to ignoring the need to utilize, as we are tonight, live streaming, online, providing online access. I think it's been a good thing, and I think going forward, churches may, in developing this capacity now, will have a blended approach to a blended outreach approach.
Agree, and there's been a bit of research done. This is internationally, and it's online. About the researcher has argued that we have the online ministries here to stay, and that the gathered church that we have known. That the gathered church has to come to grips with the fact that we virtually need to develop two parallel congregations, one that will gather and the other that will be online. It's all part of the adaptation to the new experiences. The present setting in Barbados, I think, has been going, we very much have been going both. But I think the absence of research I think the absence of research have not helped us really to affirm where we should go, and the financing of the two, I think, have remained a basic challenge, even to keep the online services going, as well as to maintain the gathered community. The financing of both have remained a basic challenge. We're open to other observations and questions. Yes, Sherry Ann Clark has a question.
Good evening. I had, I guess, two questions. First, just let me say thanks for both presentations. A lot of food for thought. Looking at Dr. Marshall, at your presentation, some of the themes that you put out there and some of the ideas you introduced, in many ways, are what people would consider sort of in the wheelhouse of the church. The importance of social justice, the whole equity and ethical issues, who's other, who's included, who's excluded, who's disadvantaged and marginalized in the context of the crisis that we are facing on top of the other ones. And so I guess part of the question, and then the interesting dynamic of, so there's this growing role for the church and a need to adapt and find new ways to minister, and at the same time, there is a disruption, as you mentioned, in terms of questioning the legitimacy and the authority of the church, again, which opens up an opportunity for governance reform, for greater democratization of the church stuff. So lots of rich stuff there. And so I guess my question is there anything that we have seen or that you have read or that you see emerging in terms of how churches have been responding to these challenges, the Black Lives Matter movement, the social justice, or their whole questions of governance, if there's anything emerging yet on that, or the areas for consideration there. And I guess also to Dean Jeffrey to ask how is the diocese looking at it? Because what struck me in listening is that there are so many elements in terms of ministering to your, staying afloat, ministering to your constituents, and also dealing with those broader global issues of your relevance and your place in the world, and obviously overarching mission of the church itself in terms of God's purpose. So to find out what the diocese itself is doing around that. Those pairs of questions. And then there was just one question for Dr. Wendy around the research in terms of looking at if there's any consideration of the psychosocial impact of how we've been worshiping, the connections and the disconnections in the spaces that we've had, and how that affects. I mean, the point raised earlier around getting some appreciation of differences by age and sex too would be interesting to look at, but I was just wondering if that's something you've considered when you're looking at the broader research. So kind of the big challenge for the church, what's happening out there and what the diocese is doing, and what you're thinking about in terms of the psychosocial aspects and mental health aspects in your research, Dr. Wendy. Thanks.
And perhaps you can get Dr. Marshall to respond to the social justice matter.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sherry Ann. And like the very good Dr. Reverend, you've summarized some of what I said better than I did. Better than I did. If I could have done that, done what you both have done, I might have spent as much as 29 minutes. But sometimes you say things that you don't know how well they are received or how they are received, and I'm happy that this is the second person that I've sought to speak to the essence of what was said and did it well. Now, visibility. there's no getting away from it. The church has to be seen to be in the vanguard of the struggle. There is no sexy way of putting that. There is no way of putting that other than just remembering, and I'm not here to preach or anything, but just remembering the life examples of saints and the Jesus example, for example. There's no way that you can do this and not render visible your sense of moral outrage. So, violence against women. It's a scourge, one of the secret shames in Barbados society. Where is the church? When the National Organization of Women organized a Life in Leggings march against violence against women, there are 16 days of activism about violence against women. The church is decorously silent. This cannot do. Not when, I'm going to single that out specifically, because right in our primary schools, at the level of reception, straight through misreadings of the biblical and other religious texts, and throughout our adult lives, you get a patriarchal or a male-dominated discourse that treats to women and girls as essentially secondary, other. My mother passed on last year, and she fought all her life against, in a private life, against being struck. I'm a person that grew up seeing my mother being struck. I'm a person that grew up, have a daughter, and pull her out of a play in a school that her primary school is a school I respect a lot. It helps mold her and shaped her. But there she is, 6 years old, with another group of her friends at 6. Girls on one side, boys on one side. King Jaja will let back alone. Okay, it's going all right. Was it that one or the one that I get a big stick and keep she cool? I think that's all part of the song. And I saw the grand rehearsal. I said, she would not do that. She would not, in that segment of the play, cower as the 6-year-old boys raise their hand, get a big stick, and I keep she cool. That's socializing violence against women, making it normalized. And lives are lost. Women lose their lives standing up at a bus stop, and their former intimate partner or their current intimate partner hacked them to death. Where is the church? My God, on a scourge. This is not just a murder. This is an epidemic of widespread proportions, and it's one of Barbados' secret shames. I have not even touched incest. But where is the church? I grew up, I never heard the church on the question. I went to a Wesleyan Holiness church. It never was discussed. Ladies in the church getting beaten. Never discussed. It's normalized. So when we talk about social justice and being in the vanguard of the struggle, I've just identified one. You've got organizations rendering visible that this is a problem. They organize every year 16 days of protests, marking the end, striving for the end of violence against women. You've got to be part of that. You've got to be either, in some solidarity with that. So I'm just mentioning one area, and I'll leave that there. But certainly you get the point. There is a way in which the question of what it means to be human in 2020 has to mean that the praxis of the church, the way it delivers its message, has to be in ways that are symbolically reverberating with struggles going on right amongst us.
The question, yes. Thank you very much for that question about the psychosocial. And you would have heard when I mentioned there were approximately 18 questions. And I didn't bring all of them to this forum, but certainly one of the questions asks about persons' anxiety. And it is recognized that things are a lot more tense, whether in homes, whether at work, whether in the supermarket, and certainly in places of worship. And the question was asked, what is your level of anxiety? Are you always anxious? It's never, sometimes, always, never, frequently. And I'll seek to expand it by looking closer at from how persons respond, why are you feeling the way that you are? And certainly recognizing the need for psychosocial support within the context of our own congregations. Because even as a healthcare provider and a person who tries to operate the best, you find yourself under an immense struggle to balance your personal life, your professional life, and your church life. And that is a delicate balance. And if you're not strong, you can literally break. So even from a personal perspective, I recognize that. And I'm saying to myself, what about the other people out there who don't have the support systems to take them through? And there's no one. And you see it almost now every day. It was so before, but I think this pandemic has brought it more to the fore. There's a guy, when I'm driving down to work, there's a guy I'm seeing on the road with a suitcase every morning. And then I see him up by Warren's at a part of the day. And then he's back there the next morning. And I'm saying to myself, where is he living? So the reality is very stark for a lot of people, and even within our own congregations. So I acknowledge what you have said about the psychosocial support and the welfare as well. Because a comment was made about the tithing and persons giving and the church asking persons to support the church. But then some of the people that we serve, our constituents, are out of work. They've been laid off. How are they managing? And how are we as a church responding to that as well? People are very proud. I recognize a person will not necessarily come and say, well, I'm out of work or I don't have. But I think we have to find ways to be vigilant and to be able to identify who those persons are, and certainly put programs in place that if people need, they can come and access without everybody knowing who is the person receiving that level of support and care, because we are very proud people as well. And we need to respect that pride while being able as a church to be able to deliver on that psychosocial need and support, because people will not necessarily say, but will need it, and we should be able to provide it accordingly. So thank you. That will certainly be part of the research plan going forward.
Thank you very much for the question with respect to what the church is doing. I think churches have been trying to respond in various ways. We've heard of churches trying to respond by way of providing hampers and other material responses on the basis of requests and need. The churches have also been responding in terms of trying to provide the type of support to individuals in the process. One area that I found continues to be challenging is in the area of the care of the elderly. That area is one that I think we need to carefully work out, because on the one hand, we need to protect the elderly, and on the other hand, we think we need to provide support and care. So, do we visit? And if we visit, under what conditions? I get a sense that though we have a support where we will make calls, there's an expectation that there should be a sense of normalcy, that people should get their visits, get their communion visits and so on. Those are some of the challenges I think we're still faced with. The matter of caring for people at the bereaved families, what is the level of ongoing support we can give, given the still restrictions in terms of the number of people who attend funerals. But these are opportunities for the church to work on. The Anglican Church will call its synod at the end of this month, October 25th, and some other time after that, to be announced fairly soon. And part of the plan is that there will be a time dedicated to looking at the mission of the church in terms of how it can respond given the current state of affairs. So that's the plan I know that the diocese is considering, where the synod reps will contribute towards the fashioning of a way for the church to respond. Meantime, I think each congregation is required to design its own program and to be alert to the needs in its particular area. Other observations or comments? Anything further from the online audience? Sherry-Ann has another question. Yes, okay. Yeah, we'll just wait for I think you should use the mic so that we can get everything properly.
It's not so much a question as a challenge. In the spirit of the train of thought of disruption and doing things differently, I would suggest that the time might be right to consider having a broader group of people input into the fashioning of the mission of the church in a post-COVID, in a COVID world, than just our synod reps. Links right back to where we talked about, if we look at the age profile of our synod reps, it probably will also will not necessarily chime with what you're looking for in terms of the future of the church and building the church. So if you want something new and different and to take full advantage of the opportunity for the church to reinvent itself in the most relevant way, we may need to rethink some of the synod structures and thinking about ways we could democratize that in terms of access and what is open for other people to listen in on. And you don't have to wait till your church, your synod rep then to tell you something at the pulpit a month after the synod report or whatever. I just putting it out there so that when you're having your diocesan discussions, that we just think very imaginatively and openly about how we can do things differently and include a wider set of people to really spark for more, I guess, diverse and innovative thinking for the church to really live true to the promise and the challenges that are ahead of us. Thanks.
Okay, yes, in that context, perhaps I can ask Dr. Marshall to say a bit more about the need for the church to deal with hierarchies. How do we I mean, the Anglican Church in itself is hierarchically structured. Well, I'm here.
Patriarchal.
And patriarchal, right. I agree. So maybe you can look at both. How can we further integrate women in the leadership of the church? And how can the church be address the hierarchical image and be more, I like the concept of the church where you You see the church as a center and a circle, and the leader is in the center. But don't let me prejudice your answer. Say a bit more about the rethinking of the hierarchies.
I'm admiring the line of thought that you're going and the exchange between yourself and I gotta get this name. Sorry, Sherry Ann. Yeah, I'm admiring the exchange because first thing is that knowledge that there's a need to just open up. And the best ways that you see this happening in other organizations, when you see hierarchies beginning to break down, is by simple recognition that there is a problem. And the problem is that you're unwittingly allowing only the influence of particular kinds of voices in the discussion to the exclusion of others. And it's not, let's assume it's not deliberate. Let me assume it's not deliberate. But you're not having young people, however you define that cohort. You're not having women playing a critical role in terms of these decision-making organs, and it has to be a commitment through acts of positive discrimination to deliberately include. That's the only way it breaks down. It can't be, well, we'll leave it down to the vagaries of somebody getting elected or selected. It has to be a deliberate policy that says, in the quest for justice, fairness, and inclusion, this is what we're going to do. This is the decision that we've made. We're going to allow these voices to be included every time, these categories of persons to be included and empowered, not just included as a token gesture, but empowered indeed, so that it begins to break things down. I don't know, to be fair, anytime you're looking at democratizing hierarchies, it requires a careful study of the particular organization. So I've just given you the generic thing, but it requires a careful, because you may find that there are power structures that exist beyond the formal. So you may be democratizing the formal structure, but there's a power behind the throne, as it were, that is very staid and stubborn, and it would just simply ignore what has just happened and impose its will. So that is what needs breaking up as well, So I'll leave that there.
Thank you. This is just past 9:15, and I think we probably should have room for another question or observation before we start to wrap up our proceedings. I think we've had a very thorough night, and certainly we've been challenged in many ways to think through the concept. COVID has provided us with opportunities. We often say in the church that whenever when there's a crisis, there's also the opportunity. And so we shouldn't only see the presence of COVID in terms of a challenge and a crisis, but we should always be on the lookout for the opportunities to see how the human experience is being renewed and refashioned. I think nature, to some extent, has experienced that. I came to the cathedral sometime last week, and I was somehow struck by the number of butterflies I saw around. It was like if I hadn't seen them for so long. You just wonder where have they come from and what has prompted that. You just wonder whether somehow there's something in the atmosphere that says that nature is coming alive in some new or fresh way. Yeah. Any general comments? Any final comments from online? None online. Any other observations from persons present? There's one here. Yes. This is Hadford Howell, who's a member of the trustees.
Good night to all. I had...
So you should stand so it can be seen. You stand up. Yeah.
Good night to all.
Yeah.
I had a similar butterfly experience at home. About 2 weeks ago, we experienced a dearth of butterflies all of a sudden that we hadn't noticed for a while. I just have a suggestion in hearing Dr. Marshall speak about finding new ways or different ways of hearing other members of the Anglican Church that we might not normally hear. And if we're finding that at Synod most of the persons are older, more experienced, should we say, a suggestion: why don't we convene a session, a day session? Morning, you could have the youth, maybe persons below, say, 40. You may get people from the various congregations to send, just like I follow the Synod pattern, where you have 2 or 3 persons per church, and you meet at, I don't know, Garfield Sobers or one of our church halls, and you have an agenda and you lay out, you'll work around the COVID situation. What can we do differently? How do we look ahead? How can we improve what we currently do? And maybe in the afternoon, you may have a session for women. Dr. Marshall mentioned it, the challenges with women. So I would just suggest that we put on the table, we look at having a situation where you have maybe it's one day, you have morning with the youth, maybe 40 and under. And in the afternoon, you could have ladies. I wouldn't say what age, but ladies. And on the agendas, when you work out the agendas, it may depend on some of the sessions, some of the issues that we are seeing happening. Maybe we need someone, maybe like Dr. Marshall, to point out to us some of the issues that he sees developing maybe in our youth, not necessarily in the Anglican Church, but across the country. But we will use the churches in the diocese to have those persons go forward. It's just a suggestion, but it's one of those things coming out of this meeting where we're not just looking at experienced persons who make up most of our congregation, but we try and get others who we may not see as much of, and try and get them to also become a part of what we're doing. And that could then affect our thinking going forward, how we respond not only to COVID, but to other issues that may be there, looking at us in the face, but we're just not dealing with them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, we've come to the end of our discussion. If we have exhausted our questions and comments, it's been, for me, a good experience to be sitting here, to be stirred by the presenters and from the questions and comments made. I think we have had a good viewership and participation from the online audience. Over 1,000 people, I've noticed. So our message has gone far and wide. And this is a good demonstration of how we need to do both. You know, we have the gathered group, and we need to bear in mind that our influence is now universal. And so I hope that our contribution tonight has helped not only the local church, but people wherever they are, the Christians wherever they are, to reflect on who we are called to be. Any closing remarks from the panelists before we invite Ella to move the vote of thanks? There's none from Dr.
Persons who would have responded to the pilot study, and I trust as we move forward within the context of the pandemic, I'll be reviewing the research plan and developing it, and as we get approval at the diocesan level, that we will get the responses from persons to help to inform really what is happening within the context of our Anglican Church. The evidence is very important for supporting what we do and why we do it, and certainly how we can move forward and strategize within the context of this pandemic. So I thank you, and I look forward to your responses in the future. And as we also say, stay safe and mind the preventative measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Dr. Marshall?
Yes, I think today for me represented a lofty ventilation. We got a chance to not only speak in terms of the crisis, but creative ways of responding. And I think the watchword is empathy. And I personally would like to leave with you the whole question of, the need to rethink what it means to be human in the current moment. All the existential needs, and to be human, again, goes beyond the tendency to just simply say, I will tolerate you. It has to be, I will embrace you. It might not necessarily embrace everything you do, but I embrace the human in you. And I just think that we have to think through what it means to be human at a time when we're thrown back on our wits and levels of desperation today. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. Now I invite Ms. Ella Hoyos, member of the trustees, to express thanks on our behalf.
Thank you very much, Dean Jeffrey. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the distinct pleasure this evening to thank everyone who have contributed to making this event the success that it has been. What a wonderful evening we've had together. What inspiring food for thought have been presented by our presenters. And let me just start with Dr. Wendy Seeley. Dr. Seeley, thank you so much for being inspired and acting on your inspiration to at least start with this pilot study. And thank you for sharing with us this evening your findings so far. We certainly look forward to the full study and what that will produce for us. But so far, we're encouraged to hear that Barbadians are being resilient and adjusting to the new normal as it is, and basically that within the church our faith remains intact. So thank you for those insights. To Dr. Don Marshall, I would also like to say a huge thank you for your thought-provoking comments. You say that we have a historically unique challenge and that the toolkits for recession and economic downturn are not equipped to deal with this particular challenge. So we will have to dig deep and do whatever is necessary, as we are told by the international agencies, to get ourselves out of this slump. And that, of course, extends into the church, where we find ourselves also in the slump. Your challenge for us to think about virtual embeddedness and how that is blurring the lines between the sacred and the secular, and what it means to be human, our considering that as well, and raising our visibility in this regard. And also the interesting notion of the church as a subject of inquiry and study, and, our being open to that kind of exercise. So again, a lot of food for thought, a lot of thought-provoking ideas. Thank you so much to both of our presenters for obviously the time and the care that you took to prepare for this exercise and to share with us. And to Dean Jeffrey, our moderator, thank you so much, as usual, for your very deliberate and thoughtful way of handling things, sir. You certainly allowed everybody an opportunity to be heard and to ask the questions that need to be asked, and also to offer theological and church-based views on the topic that we're discussing tonight. So thank you very much, Dean Jeffrey, for your even-handed moderation of this evening's exercise. I would also like to thank Reverend Sandra for the opening prayers, Mr. Hadford Howell for his welcome and introductory remarks, Ms. Sharianne Clark for introducing the presenters and the moderator, the members of the Board of Directors of the St. Michael Center for Faith and Action, the members of the Church Committee of the Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels who organized this event. I would also like to thank Dr. George for coming out. I would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the public, members of the church community, members of the wider church, for coming and sharing in this event this evening. Although it is socially distanced, it just makes a difference when there are people around. Doing this alone in an empty space would not quite be the same. So thank you for taking the time and for risking. It seems everything we do nowadays is a risk, for coming out. I want to also thank those of our viewers in the virtual space, 1,000 of them I'm hearing, who have joined in with us this evening. Welcome to the Cathedral Church of St. Michael and All Angels. I hope that you've enjoyed your time with us, and I hope that you will join us in the future when we have other such activities. And finally, I just want to thank the organizers. I know that it's your Patrona Festival and you have a lot on the go, so thank you for reorganizing the space so it is a little bit more chat-friendly as opposed to the traditional use of the sacred space. So thank you for that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, and all that remains is for me to wish you a safe journey home. Thank you.
Let's bow our heads for the closing prayer. Almighty God, we are yours, and it is our delight to worship and to serve you with our intellect, the thoughts of our heads, the words of our lips, and the works of our hands. We give you thanks this evening for the knowledge which was shared by Dr. Seeley and Dr. Marshall, so that when we leave this place, we would have deepened our own knowledge, but with determination to meet the challenges before us, to see all persons in body, mind, soul, and spirit as they truly are. Help us, Lord, when the hard questions are asked, that we respond honestly and open ourselves to research so that we may find an answer. In times of anxiety, give us serenity to ease and to calm whatever situation we are in. In times of hardship, give us courage to face the difficulties. In times of uncertainty, give us patience, Lord, to rediscover ourselves and the church. And at all times, give us that quiet trust in your wisdom and love. May the good Lord bless us. May he guard us in our going out and our coming in. May he keep us steadfast in faith, free from sin, and safe from danger. We ask all this through the name of his Son, our Savior, Jesus, our Lord. Amen. And now the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us and remain with us always. Amen.
Thank you very much. Good night and be safe. In the pre-COVID climate, we had refreshments to follow, but we are not able to do that. But there is water available that you may at least have a drink as you go. Thank you, and be good to be here. Thank you very much.